To get finished. If I can see the clock without a glitter, I may just look at my cell phone here and try to keep it very, very limited as to time. We may get through this, we may not get through this study. Matthew chapter 24 is used oftentimes as a sugar stick for those in the denominational world who believe the false doctrine of premillennialism. And so, in light of this, oftentimes they go to Matthew chapter 24, and they begin to say certain things. What about this? What about the signs that are here? We see these signs, don't we, today? And how can you not say this is what's going on? Don't you believe what the Bible teaches about these things? Don't you see that this is a fulfillment of Matthew chapter 24? And on they go. But oftentimes, even members of the body of Christ, those that have been members for many years, are just not able to give an answer because there are some words that are in there, some phrases and some sentences and some clauses and language that can be very confusing. What we're going to do this morning is get as far as we can in Matthew chapter 24, and if I see that we're not going to get to what I consider the meat of the matter, then I'll flash forward to those verses. When we look, and I got to change it, there we go. When we look at Matthew chapter 24, here's what I want you to do. I want you, if you will, to go to Matthew chapter 24 and look at verse 34. Now, if we're going to understand Matthew chapter 24, it begins with verse 34. And what I want you to do is underline that verse, put a circle around that verse, put that verse in brackets if you want. But beside that verse, please write the key to understanding 24 is verse 34. Everything before verse 34 happens 2,000 years ago, okay? And that's what we're going to be looking at. If you want an understanding of Matthew 24, go first to verse 34. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass. That generation 2,000 years ago. It shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. How many of you in here, by show of hands, can remember where you were September 11th, 2001? That would be me. Now, just out of interest, how many of you in here had someone come to you on September 11th or a little after 2001 and say, this is that which is being fulfilled? Really? One. I was another. Those planes crashed into those buildings, and those buildings fell. The Pentagon, and then another flight was overtaken by some of the people that were on board. One man came to me and said, this is the end. This is what's prophesied of in the Bible. Now it's wars and rumors of wars, and now I know for a certain that this is it. When we look at Matthew chapter 24, verse 34 is the key to understanding this chapter. Now, there we go. We'll get to Matthew 23:36 a little later. It says the same thing. Now, if we were going into a deeper study of Matthew 24, it would definitely start with Matthew chapter 23, okay? And all of the woes that were pronounced against the scribes and Pharisees, which Jesus called hypocrites. But he uses the same type of language in Matthew 23 and verse 36, which we'll get to later. This generation shall not pass. Now, when we look at the destruction of Jerusalem, these things, you may look at Matthew 21, 43 through 44, and these passages. I will share these slides with you if you want these shared with you. The destruction of Jerusalem is what's taking place in Matthew chapter 24. History bears this out if you'll only study history alongside it. Maybe the writings of Josephus, Tacitus, and others. Titus, in 68 A.D., surrounded Jerusalem to destroy Jerusalem. This is called the Ark, or some people say Arch of Titus. And within it is a relief. And this relief shows the things from the temple in Jerusalem being taken out. This was during the destruction of Jerusalem. And here is a better rendering of that relief. Now, as we look at Matthew chapter 24, let's first look at the first few verses here. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another, that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us. Now I want you to take note of something before we look at what they ask. They ask three different questions. Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? Jesus answers these three questions in order. I want you to keep that in mind. Now let's look at verses 4 and 5. And Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. Friends, this is nothing new. This was going on before the destruction of Jerusalem, leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem, and we see that this was taking place just like Jesus said that it would. In the book of Acts chapter 5, 35 and 36, and said unto them, Ye men of Israel, take heed to yourselves what ye intend to do as touching these men. For before these days rose up Theudas, boasting himself to be somebody, to whom a number of men, about 400, joined themselves, who was slain, and all, as many as obeyed him, were scattered and brought to naught. Many people were looked at as being, oh, this must be the one. This is the one that's going to lead us, and we're going to have a kingdom once again. Men would come and men would go, but there was only one Christ. But Jesus is saying to them, this is going to happen. Here's a sign. Now, I want you to take note. All of these are signs leading to the destruction of Jerusalem. In verses 6 through 8 of Matthew chapter 24, And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginnings of sorrows. There have always been wars and rumors of wars. This was something that was very, very precise. It was something that Jesus was honing in on, that he was really very specific about concerning Jerusalem and the Jewish age. It was going to be ended with this. Some of these wars, history tells us, killed many Jews. This would have been very important in their mind. Jesus said, you're going to hear this, wars and rumors of wars. Now, when these things came to pass, take note, 50,000 Jews were killed in one battle against the Syrians. 20,000 Jews were killed at Caesarea. These things were happening after Jesus had predicted those things. Very precise to the Jews and to the Jewish and toward the Jewish system. It wasn't as though he was saying this is going to happen 2,000 years from now, 3,000 years from now, 4,000 years from now, because of verse what? Can anybody tell me without looking? 34. The key to understanding 24 is verse 34. Always remember that whatever we're looking at, verse 34 is the key. In the book of Acts chapter 11 and verse 28, and in these days came prophets from Jerusalem unto Antioch, and there stood up one of them named Agabus, and signified by the Spirit that there should be great dearth throughout all the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. You think about these not only wars and rumors of wars, but you think about these famines and pestilences and all of these things. People were going to go through a very hard time. It is said that after Jerusalem was compassed about with the Roman Empire, the Roman army, the zealots within inside those walls began to fight among themselves and among some of the other Jews. They were burning their food supply, grain storage. They were taking and burning those things which would have allowed them to withstand the Romans being outside those walls, not for days, not for weeks, not for months, but they were burning their supplies that would have lasted them for years. And because of this, there was great famine within the city walls. It is said that there was such a great famine that one lady even took her dead child and cooked it, boiled it, and ate it. People were taking their shoes and their belts, and they were trying to eat the leather. But when we look at Acts chapter 11, this was prophesied again. He signified by the Spirit that there would be great dearth throughout all the world. It was hard. You look at, I got to point this just the right way, I guess. Okay, I'm just going to say next slide. Up there. All right, that's not working. All right, thank you. Earthquakes were reported for that time period by ancient writers. The cities of Laodicea, Hierapolis, and Colossae were overthrown, and Pompeii was overwhelmed and almost destroyed by an earthquake. Pompeii would eventually be destroyed by what? Can you remember? A volcano. Josephus tells of the earthquake of Judea. We don't have time to go into the writings of Josephus, but when you look and you lay beside everything that Jesus is saying here concerning the destruction of Jerusalem, it is truly astonishing and amazing. Now, 9 through 13, let's look at these verses. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall rise, and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. Now, as we look at this, Matthew 10, 21 and 22 is a portion of Scripture we can go to. And brother shall deliver up brother to death, and the father, the child, and the children shall rise up against their parents and cause them to be put to death, and ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake. But he that endureth to the end shall be saved. Same type of language being used. Matthew 10, 23, but when they persecute you in this city, flee ye into another. For verily I say unto you, ye shall not have gone over the cities of Israel till the Son of Man be come. So we see here in Matthew chapter 24 that things were going to be happening. We see that there was going to be many false prophets, and the iniquity shall abound, and the love of many shall grow cold. But they had to endure to the end. Now look at verse 14. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. Now, isn't that interesting? In Matthew 28 and verse 18, what is Jesus giving there to His disciples? The Great Commission. See, Matthew 10, it was the limited commission. Matthew 28, Mark 16, it is the Great Commission. All power hath been given unto me in heaven and in earth. Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. So we see the Great Commission. This gospel, the gospel of Christ, was going to be preached unto all the world before whatever He's saying is going to happen is going to happen. What do we read in Colossians chapter 1, verse 5 and 6? Or verses 5 and 6, for the hope which is laid up for you in heaven, whereof ye heard before the word of the truth of the gospel, which is come unto you as it is in what? All the world. Verse 23 of Colossians 1, if ye continue in the faith, grounded and settled, and be not moved away from the hope of the gospel, which ye have heard, and which was preached to every creature which is under heaven, whereof I, Paul, am made a minister. Jesus said to go into all the world. Guess what they did? They went into all the world. Guess when Paul wrote this? Oh, the book of Colossians is dated 60 to 64 AD. About 4 years prior to those armies surrounding, those Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem to destroy Jerusalem, to make Jerusalem desolate. So now, when we look at verse 15, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Somebody says, well, what is the abomination of desolation? Matthew 23, their house would be left unto them what? Desolate. It's a desolation. It's a destruction. Look at Luke chapter 21 and verse 20. It answers what this is. And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. That's what verse 15 of Matthew 24 is talking about. It's when you see these things, it is nigh, it's at hand. Not 2,000 years from now or 3,000 years of now, 2 or 3,000 years from then. Jesus said it's going to happen, it's at nigh when you see this. And notice, He says, when you see this, who's going to see it? They were. That generation was not going to pass until this had taken place. They were going to see Jerusalem compassed with armies. They were going to see the abomination of desolation, which was prophesied of by Daniel. And you can look at these verses. You can take a picture of this slide. We're not going to touch on these for time's sake. But I want you to take note that these things were all going to take place. It was so bad that when they were hungering and their children were starving to death, and their mothers and their daddies were getting frail because their food supply had been burned by the zealots and others, they went outside those walls to forage for food. And inside of their families that were still inside those walls, the Romans captured those people. They captured daddies. They captured husbands. They captured those men who, for their family's sake, needed something to eat. They went outside to forage for food, to get food. The Romans captured them, and the Romans crucified them in plain sight of their family. One brother told me, and I have not personally read this, but he had read about the destruction of Jerusalem, and he said that there were so many people crucified and being crucified outside the city walls of Jerusalem that the Romans were running out of timber to make the crosses. Now, we're going to move on and just briefly go before we hit verse 28. I want to read through this and maybe make some comments. Verse 16 beginning, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Now, when they began to first take note of, okay, here's the army. We got to get out of Jerusalem. We need to go out another way. Here they are. They're going to begin to surround. We got to leave. He said, when you see this, you flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. You don't have time. You don't have time to go get those family heirlooms. You don't have time to go get anything. As soon as you see it, You leave. You go. You have no time. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. If you're out in the field working and you were to look in toward the horizon and you were to see the Roman army coming, you go. You don't go to you don't even go get your clothes. You worry about that later. You better worry about your life. You better worry about your family's life. Verse 19, and woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. Does anybody know why? Can anybody tell me why that would be?
The gates would be closed.
Who said that?
I did.
Okay. The gates would be closed. They would not be able to get out of the city. And that army would continue to surround. When we look at verse 20, but pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. Now, I've already told you. You look at the things that were going on with the picture, and there's going to be some horrible suffering. Take note of verse 22. And except those days. What I want you to do is underline those days. Except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, underline this, those days shall be shortened. Then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christ and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you before, wherefore if they shall say unto you, Behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not. For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even to the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. You're going to know it. You don't believe it. There are signs in those days that I'll be coming, but coming in judgment. Coming in judgment. Now, let's look at verse 28. For whereas the carcass is, there will be the eagles gathered. Many a false prophet. Many of those that say, oh, I believe in premillennialism and so should you. Here's the sign. This nation has an eagle as its emblem. What do we have? An eagle. Other nations have had eagles. When we look at the book of Deuteronomy chapter 24 verse 49, we see how this is being used. We're going to see that oftentimes eagles were used in language where one nation was overtaking another. Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 49, the Lord shall bring a nation against thee from afar, and from the end of the earth, as swift as the what flieth? Eagle flieth. A nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand. There's going to be a foreign nation overtake you. And as the eagle flies. Hosea chapter 8 and verse 1, set the trumpet to thy mouth. He shall come as an eagle against the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and trespassed against my law. Here again an eagle is used. Habakkuk chapter 1 and verse 8, their horses also are swifter than the leopards, and are more fierce than the evening wolves. And their horsemen shall spread themselves, and their horsemen shall come from afar. They shall fly as the eagle that hasteth to eat. This nation is going to come to you quickly and overpower you quickly as an eagle that hastens to eat. An eagle that's looking for meat, something to devour, something to take in. So you see, this is language that the Jews were very used to. But then you look at Matthew 23 and verse 36. It's the same as Matthew 24 and verse 34. Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation. You look at Matthew 24 and verse 34. Verily I say unto you, all these things all these things, or these things shall come to pass in this generation, be fulfilled. Matthew 24:34. Now, we're going to look at verse 29. Now, here's where there's a specific type of language used. So I've hit it about right. We got 15 minutes, and it may take just about that. Now, what kind of language is being used beginning here in Matthew 24 and verse 29? Can anybody tell me? Apocalyptic language. Apocalyptic language was something that the Jews were very, very familiar with. You and I, not so much, okay? And when someone begins to first read this type of language, in their minds they're thinking this can mean nothing more than the end of the world. I remember years ago, I heard a gospel preacher preach on Matthew chapter 24. I went to the gospel meeting, and he went and he completely confused me. Completely confused me. He was saying from this verse to verse 27, it means before. It means talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. From 28 on, it means the second coming. Then right before verse 34, it goes back to the destruction of Jerusalem. I walked out of that church building more confused about Matthew chapter 24, and I thought, I'll never understand Matthew chapter 24. I bought a little book at a lectureship. You know what the book was called? Matthew 24. Matthew 24. I purchased that book. I read that book. And I'll share that book with Don. I plan on sharing that. And maybe he'll share it with y'all. And I think he will. It's an amazing little book. He started with verse 34. Yes.
To make a comment, when people hear apocalyptic language, the word's confusing.
Mm-hmm.
And they think, what is he talking about? I hate when people use fancy words that sound intelligent, but it means end-time language.
Mm-hmm.
And we use that kind of language today. We might say to somebody, buddy, your world's about to come to an end.
Mm-hmm.
That's all it's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
The Lord would describe destruction in the Old Testament and compare it to the end of time.
Mm-hmm.
And he would say to a nation, your world's about to come to an end. And if you look at this, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun shall be darkened, the moon shall... What he's saying to Jerusalem is, your world's about to come to an end. And you look at all the generations, and he uses that same language, and he compares it to the end of time. And so, when you look at the Jews, and he's saying the Jewish nation is really about to come to an end, but the premillennialists, they want to say, no, this is talking about the end of the world.
Right.
And so, anyway, I'll shut up and let you go.
No. And I'm getting there too. That was a good point. And so when we look at this, I want you to take note of the language. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Somebody says, this has got to be talking about the end of the world. Remember, this is how I started this class. You remember watching it. You remember seeing it unfold. You know, Lynn and I went to Pigeon Forge, and there is a museum there. And this museum has a portion of this museum is concerning 9/11. I went in, we watched the videos. I began to cry. Old feelings were stirred up because I remember watching all of this unfold. I remember how I felt. You know, our fathers and maybe grandfathers had the same type feelings at the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And those feelings, if they were still alive for both, those old feelings were stirred up. I remember watching the second plane fly in. I didn't see the first. I just saw the big gaping hole in the building. But as I was watching the television screen, I was eating breakfast at work, And here came the other one and flew in. And then I heard of another one near the Pentagon. And then I heard of another one. But when you look and remember the videos and the live television that you saw these buildings collapse. And then you began to see these large clouds of dust and dirt and debris just cover the air. How would you describe that? Because people were running away from all of this. How would you describe that? The eagles flew with vengeance upon the carcass.
Keith,
Yes.
it just came to my mind when you were saying that Alan Jackson had a song about this, and he asked, where were you when the world stopped turning? That's apocalyptic language.
It is.
And we still use it, and that's exactly how he described this event.
And so, I think Don's a country fan. Did not know that. So, but yeah, Alan Jackson, when the world stopped turning, apocalyptic language. But if we were to put it in this type of language, which is, when you look at it, it's apocalyptic, it's end time type language showing the devastation of something. The way we had our lives in our world. How would you describe it? And it's almost poetic. The eagles flew with vengeance upon the carcass. This other nation came in, and like an eagle, they came in. And we didn't see it coming. Not necessarily talking about the airplanes, but they came in, we didn't see it coming. No one saw it coming. No one did. The sun shall be darkened. What happened when the towers fell? Couldn't see the sun. The moon did not give light. Couldn't see the moon. Stars from heaven fall. Sometimes stars are in reference to important people. Maybe it comes to mind those people that, because they didn't want to be burned to death, what happened? They jumped. Powers shaken. The world stopped turning. The world was watching. It affected the world. It affected us. You see, we could use the same type language in reference to things we go through in our lives. Now, look at verse 30. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Surely this is talking about the second coming. This has to be talking about the second coming. When you look at Luke 21 and verse 20, and when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. No, it's not talking about the second coming. It's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Take note of the very same type language used. Isaiah chapter 13 and verse 10, considering the downfall of Babylon. For the stars of heaven and the constellation thereof shall not give their light, and the sun shall be darkened and his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. The downfall of Idumea. Isaiah 34 and verse 4, and all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll, and all their hosts shall fall down as the leaf falleth from off the vine, and as a falling fig from the fig tree. You see, they were very familiar with this type of language. The downfall of Idumea, Isaiah 34 and verse 5, for my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Behold, it shall come down upon Idumea and upon the people of my curse to judgment. The downfall of Egyptian rulers. Ezekiel 32 and verse 7, and when I shall put thee out, I will cover the heaven and make the stars thereof dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give her light. This is all the same type of language. It doesn't mean in Matthew 24 that Jesus is coming as far as his second coming is concerned, as many people say. Don?
Sorry, I keep interrupting.
No, that's fine.
One thing that people get hung up on in Matthew 24:30, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. Literally, this carries with it the idea in heaven denotes the locality of the Son of Man, not the locality of the sign.
Right.
So people think they're going to see a sign in heaven, but the sign is, the destruction is the sign, and it is symbolic of the fact that Christ is now in heaven at the throne of God. Because when Christ was set down at the right hand of the throne of God in heaven, that's when the Christian system came into effect, and AD 70 was the end of the Jewish system. So the sign of the destruction was the sign that the Son of Man is in heaven, not that they were going to look up into heaven and see a sign.
Right. And it does not say, and then shall appear the Son of Man in heaven. That's a big difference. How many minutes? Am I done? 5 minutes. I better get through this. When you look at 30 and 31 again, the sign of the Son of Man, and then I want you to take note, and he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from the end of heaven, one end of heaven to the other. Somebody says, surely the Lord coming in the clouds. Not necessarily. Once again, you look at the fall of Egypt. Isaiah chapter 19 and verse 1, the burden of Egypt. Behold, the Lord what? Rideth upon a what? Swift cloud, and shall come into Egypt. And the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. All the same type of language that is being used. Let's see here. I believe, well, that's good. I guess I'm finished. When we look, I want you to take note of something here in Matthew chapter 24. When you look at verse 34, verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Remember I told you to underline those days in verse 19 and verse 22. And these things, these are signs that they could visually see, and they were going to visually see concerning the destruction of Jerusalem. Used in this special type of language. But when you look at verse 36, those days, that language is not used. Remember the last question had to do with the end of the what? World. You look at verse 3. He deals with that beginning with verse 36. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. And from here on out, when you go through the rest of chapter 24 and even into chapter 25, you're going to see the end of the world and judgment. Yes?
36 is a transition verse.
It is a transition verse. Just like 34 was the key to understanding, verse 36 is the transition verse of Matthew chapter 24. Any other comments in closing? All right. Do we end with a prayer? Okay. Any more comments? All right. Thank you for your time.